Good afternoon. Hello. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me in the back of the room? Welcome. It's just wonderful to see so many smiling eyes, as they say these days, here today to partake in this wonderful celebration that touches so closely to Grace Cottage and the history of Valley Cares. My name's Doug DeVello, and I'm the president and CEO of Grace Cottage, and I really want to welcome everybody to our beautiful campus on a magnificent day. I think this is one of the reasons why we all are so blessed to be living in Vermont on days like this. We can really appreciate how good we have it here. I just want to just talk a little bit about my experience. When I came to Grace Cottage almost 4.5 years ago, it struck me almost immediately that this is truly a unique healthcare organization, unlike any that I've ever worked in prior to coming to Grace Cottage. And one of the things that really impressed upon me was the immediate realization that the care provided at Grace Cottage by all of the people that work here, whether they're direct providers, nurses, support staff, they treat everybody as equals. They treat everybody with equity and with equality, and care is all about the person. It's about the patient. And that, I think, is what makes Grace Cottage such a wonderful and unique healthcare organization, and one of the reasons that I was so excited about joining this incredible place. This past year, we embarked on a truly transformative effort at Grace Cottage to really highlight and work diligently on telling our story about equality and equity. And we put together a team of really talented people. George Twilliger is here. He was a key part of that team. Summer Birch, another one of our providers here on that team. I see some other people that were involved as well directly. Jen Newman in the back and others. And their effort was to really create an awareness in the community about the great work that we do here at Grace Cottage and about how we focus on equity and equality. And I can tell you the results of that hard work resulted in us receiving a top performer score of 95 out of a possible 100 from the HRC's Health Equality Index. Really put Grace Cottage on the map, and we're one of 2 hospitals in the state that achieved that high recognition level by the HRC. And so we're really proud of that effort, and we're going to continue our work with members of the community, with partners and others to tell our story, to make sure people understand that regardless of what they believe, regardless of who their parents are, regardless of what their race is or who they love, when they come to Grace Cottage, they're going to get nothing but the best we have to offer, and everyone will be treated equally. And so I know you'll join us and help us on that effort going forward, and we really are excited to celebrate this wonderful event today. And I'm going to turn it over to Andrea Seaton. She's our Senior Director for Development, for Marketing, and for Communications. And she's going to say a few words about what this celebration truly means. Andrea?
Thank you, Doug.
You're welcome.
I can take this off just while I'm up here. It's wonderful to see all these faces, and it brings back Warren Kronemeyer and Leon Ingall so very clearly and vividly to all of our minds, to those of us who knew these 2 gentlemen, who are the reason that we're sitting here today. When Warren and Leon decided to move their antiques business from New York City, Warlé, which some people don't realize that's an abbreviation for Warren and Leon, and they moved up here to Townsend, and boy, did they add color to our lives in Townsend. Warren was the outgoing one. Leon kind of stayed in the background as much as he could, as much as Warren would let him. But they bought the brick house up the road here, and 9.85 acres, and had their antique shop there, and became so much a part of the community, whether it was with the church or with the hospital or any other community organizations that they could be part of. So, segue to 2004, when Warren informed us that they wanted to leave a legacy in Townsend in the form of a senior living facility. And they gave their house and property to Grace Cottage Hospital, and in turn we transferred it to Valley Cares. Because there was a tremendous need with the closing of Hines Home that we had to close because of reimbursement issues. We had 14 beds here in this building. This was, some of you may remember, this was a concrete porch with louvered glass windows, not particularly attractive, but the residents ate their meals in the dining room, which is now our Holt Conference Room, and the living room is also our Holt Conference Room. And Warren's room was just down the hall, where Dr. George Terwilliger and C.J. King have their offices now. His room was split into two to make offices eventually. So many of you visited Warren. I was walking down the hallway with Renata, and she was remembering when she visited Warren down the hall. We had given him lifetime perpetual care in exchange for his gift of his house and property. And we honored that, of course, and as the Valley Cares was dedicated on October 26th. I have to look at my notes to make sure I get the year right. October 26, 2007. Warren had died on October 3rd, 2007. So he didn't make it to Valley Cares, but he knew the legacy that he was leaving for this community, which was a wonderful legacy, and has given so much wonderful, wonderful care to the people of Valley Cares. And I want to just give a shout out to Valley Cares and to Joanne Blanchard, who's their director, who's here today, because it's thanks to Valley Cares, it's thanks to Warren and Leon that we are able to provide, that Townsend has such stellar elder care. So we are here today because of Andy Ingall, who is Leon and Warren's cousin from New York City. And Andy called me about a year ago and asked for some time so that he could talk about Warren and Leon if I remembered and knew them, and I said I did. And that was the first time he was dipping his toe into Townsend. And he wanted to resurrect the legacy of Warren and Leon. And so we spoke, and then Scott Heller and Dave King got involved, and they've brought all of this, Andy, Scott, and Dave, to fruition today. So we're very, very grateful to them, and with no further ado, I'll interview Scott Heller. Scott Heller and his husband, Dave King, own Men's Bed and Breakfast up in Newfane, and they are very, very important in the LGBTQ plus community in this area. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrea. It gives me great pleasure to be here today and to see everybody, and to have seen a number of you last night up at Frog Meadow for Andy's welcome reception. It gives me extraordinary pleasure to be here after this journey and to introduce Andy. Andy is Leon and Warren's cousin, and among many other things is an advocate for LGBTQ elders and refugees. And the road to here is kind of a curious one. About a year ago, I was online and got a notification on Instagram for a recommended page. The page was called Warlé on Lexington. And I thought to myself, there could only be one Warlé. And as I reviewed the contents of the page that Andy had created, I learned so much about Warren, Leon, and Warlé. And of course, me being me, I reached out to Andy immediately. This was all happening as we began our conversation with Joanne Blanchard, who's the executive director of Valley Cares, to create an LGBTQ initiative to honor Leon and to honor Warren and their bequest, which ultimately led to the creation of Valley Cares. This is the kismet that brings us here today. Andy Ingall is creator of Warlé, Yesterday, Today, a multimedia project that re-envisions his cousin's mid-century boutique as a pop-up site for discussion, for storytelling, and art that inspires action on behalf of LGBTQ elders and refugees. So please help me welcome Andy.
Thank you, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. Let me get this on. Are we good? Thank you for inviting me to take part in today's celebration in honor of Warren Kronemeyer and Leon Ingall, and I want to give a special welcome to people in Zoom land. If you have any anecdotes or memories, feel free to put them in the chat, and then we hope to send that out at a later time to all of you. My project, Warlé, Yesterday and Today, touches on themes of migration, displacement, and caregiving. So I would be remiss not to acknowledge and celebrate Abenaki people and other native peoples, past, present, and future, who care for this land. So, here's a photo of my ancestors. Leon Ingall, seen here on the left, and Warren Kronemeyer with a very fetching hat on the right. They're sitting on the steps of their home in Townsend. Nikki the Pekingese is peeking through the door. Last June, in conjunction with LGBTQ+ Pride Month, I read an essay by a friend and colleague who serves as a photo archivist for The Forward, a Jewish newspaper that's about 125 years old. Her article was about the importance of mining history for queer traces, and it inspired me to dig in. I could not have imagined the extent of information that I was able to collect. First, through genealogical records on Ancestry.com. During the height of the pandemic, I was able to access documents for free using my New York Public Library card. I also located newspapers and magazines about Warren and Leon in library databases, and most important, through the help of Andrea Seaton, I tracked down Warren and Leon's friends and conducted interviews. I found published essays, letters, and poems written by Warren. I've discovered artwork by Leon, as well as the antiques and objects that some of you purchased from them, or that you gifted to me. And there's so much we'll never know. Leon and Warren died in 2002 and 2007, respectively. Had I actually met them and had the opportunity to conduct interviews, like I did with several of you, I'm not even sure they'd provide answers to all my questions. There are experiences that are just too painful to share. And there are events and relationships that we keep private. I can't provide a complete biography of Warren and Leon. Their story has missing pieces, like shards of antique porcelain, china, and crystal. When Warren and Leon moved to Townsend from New York City in 1980, the property they bought at 457 Grafton Road included 10 acres, a brick federal-style farmhouse, a sugar shack, 2 sheds, and a garage built in the 1960s. And you can see that to the left, and you can barely make out the Warlé Antique sign there. They converted that garage into the antique store. The exterior was unremarkable, but walking inside was like entering a portal to another world. The room was full of cabinets of curiosities and exotic treasures. They proudly informed customers that Warlé specialized in fine European antiques. And according to a few of my interview subjects, if a tourist showed up at their doorstep in search of early Americana, Warren and Leon practically chased them away. Scott, what would they bark?
No country furniture.
No country furniture. They were lovers of the old continent. That was where Leon entered the fashion industry in 1930s Berlin. In the years after World War II, Warren worked as a journalist and learned the antiques trade in the south of France. Their personal and professional lives took root in Europe. Now here's a photo of that was taken last year at the former location of Warlé on Manhattan's Upper East Side. It's the corner of Lexington and 80th Street. The original boutique, which they co-founded in 1958, sold objects, but also traded in aspirations of European elegance, luxury, and sophistication. Their business grew into furniture restoration, art framing, and interior decorating. And I suppose Leon, or Léon, with an accent aigu over the E, had a special allure to clients because of his previous work as a designer in Berlin, Paris, London, and New York. In the year Warlé opened, 1958, the New York Times described it as a, quote, jewel box of a boutique. Quote, in the window, reposing on a bed of luscious red felt, is a hot chocolate service of eggshell Sèvres china. Within the boutique, a crimson rug continues the red theme of the window decor. Rich blue is splashed over the walls, and shelves are laden with everything from French cologne to Italian alabaster paperweights studded with tiny gold bugs. End of quote. Later in the fall of 1958, Q magazine, which was the precursor to New York magazine, also featured a blurb about Warlé. Quote, it is just 6 months old and well worth either a browsing or buying visit. Warlé is tiny, but neat. No jumble shop this. On the elegant side, it offers the best of the old combined with the best of the new. End of quote. Now, as a journalist and writer, Warren, without a doubt, had the skills to craft a press release, to pitch a story, and the press contacts needed to promote a new business. Q Magazine's blurb ended with this, quote, Warren Kronemeyer, Warlé's owner, has opened this boutique as a branch of a shop he operated on the Riviera for 10 years. New Yorkers will make him welcome again in his hometown, end of quote. Warren succeeded in getting the qualities of Warlé's brand across, refinement, urbanity, worldliness, but Q Magazine got one fact wrong. Warren was not the sole owner of Warlé. All you have to do is look at the logo. First thing you notice is the unique lettering, most likely hand-drawn by Leon. Warlé is a portmanteau word. In French, porter means to carry, manteau, coat. A portmanteau is a wardrobe trunk with two parts hinged together. You flip the trunk on its vertical side, and voila. In one section, you hang garments, and in the other, you store shoes, undergarments, hats, and other accessories in drawers. The author, Lewis Carroll, came up with the portmanteau word. In his most famous book, Through the Looking Glass, he invented nouns, verbs, adjectives that combined two words into one. These were like linguistic mashups infused with new meaning. At first, Alice is bewildered by these portmanteau words in the nonsense poem Jabberwocky. But Humpty Dumpty explains to her that slivey means live and slimy. Mimsy means flimsy and miserable. Today, Alice and Humpty Dumpty might be discussing Brexit while chillaxing over brunch. A wardrobe trunk or portmanteau was essential luggage if you traveled frequently on transatlantic steamships like Warren and Leon did during the post-war years. And a fashion designer, like Leon, would need several extra trunks for business trips. Leon's career in fashion began in Weimar, Berlin. Although born into an assimilated Jewish family from Russia, his teenage years and young adulthood were in Germany. There's a story that his mother hid the family jewels in the car radiator and in the lining of Leon's clothing as they fled from the Bolsheviks. Two key archives help me learn a bit about Leon's early professional life in Berlin. I located a dossier on Leon and his parents at the French National Archives. That's it here. Between 1936 and 1938, Leon paid several visits to the French consulate in Berlin. He sought permission to travel to Paris for work. In visa applications, he states that his employer, Max Behrendt, sends him to Paris 4 times a year to purchase samples of haute couture gowns. Between the wars, Berlin had a substantial ready-to-wear fashion industry. They would copy the latest garments for mass production. So by the mid-1920s, there were 80,000 companies, and half of them were Jewish-owned. And they employed around 200,000 workers, including Leon. The second archive is right here in Townsend, and it contains evidence of Leon's work in fashion. The Thompson family were part of Leon's and Warren's inner circle of friends. Warren and Leon recognized that Liza Thompson, at a young age, expressed an interest in art and design. Warren and Leon designated her as the keeper of Leon's archive, which contains hundreds of sketches, illustrations, drawings, news clippings, and other ephemera. Like all Jewish-owned businesses, Max Behrendt's company was ultimately liquidated by the Nazis. But Max had the foresight and resources to open a satellite business in England. He emigrated to London in 1935. 4 years later, Behrendt assembled a team of former employees who also had the means and the luck to escape the Nazis. That team included Leon. I know this because Liza's collection includes this invitation to the opening of Behrendt's first and last collection with his new British company. The card is dated September 6, 1939, just 5 days after Hitler invaded Poland. But the start of World War II was not going to stop the fashion world. With Leon's help, Behrendt launched a collection of sports suits, dresses, cocktail gowns, and skirts. The front of this invitation, you have an illustration of a woman in high heels. She's wearing a dress with shoulder pads appropriate for a football player. The hemline is just below the knee. The waist is tiny. Lots of fabric to emphasize and widen the hips. Her cigarette smoke curves elegantly in the air like her hourglass figure. And this feminine archetype appears again and again in Leon's illustrations and drawings. Think Joan Crawford, who starred in The Women, a film that was released in 1939, the same year Leon designed this collection. Powerful, cool, severe, unapproachable. So the discovery of this invitation, along with the French visa application, offered me evidence of how Leon supported himself during his sojourn in London. To learn about the next chapter of Leon's migration story, I relied on a dossier housed in the New England Historic Genealogical Society. It's Leon's case file from HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. HIAS remains the oldest resettlement organization in the world, now serving immigrants and refugees of all backgrounds. This dossier includes an affidavit signed by my grandfather Morris on behalf of Leon. Morris served as guarantor for many relatives escaping anti-Semitism, those who were longing for freedom, and those seeking opportunity. Morris himself had arrived in Boston from a town in the Ukraine just a few decades before Leon. Leon sailed from England on the SS Samaria on November 8, 1940. Yes, Morris and Grandma Bess took Leon in, but he only stayed there for a few months. In March of 1941, he listed his place of residence on West 77th Street, in Manhattan. This was in a declaration of intention that I found. This form was the first step towards naturalization of those seeking US citizenship. America's entry into World War II put a pause on Leon's fashion career. But the draft was advantageous for Leon and other immigrants. Conscription fast-tracked his naturalization process, and the Army was where Leon met his lifelong partner, Warren Kronemeyer. The military presented transformative opportunities for gay men and lesbians, particularly those who felt isolated in rural, sparsely populated communities. Most certainly, queer soldiers faced discrimination. Homosexuality was considered a mental illness and a justification for a less than honorable discharge. But at the same time, lesbians and gay men found friendship, intimacy, a secret society, and in the case of Warren and Leon, they also found love. Warren had shared with friends in Townsend how he and Leon met at some Army social function. There's not a lot of detail. Warren eyed an elegantly dressed 30-something man across the room. Leon carried himself like a ballet dancer. In fact, he studied ballet as a child. When a dancer is praised for good épaulement, it means you have style and carriage. When I hear épaulement, I think of epaulettes on military jackets. The physicality of an ideal dancer or a soldier isn't all that different. In the late 1990s, Warren required extra support to care for Leon, who was suffering from Alzheimer's. Warren was struggling as the primary caregiver. Their social worker, Janet Kramer, and Bob Backus, a friend and medical director of Grace Cottage, asked why Leon wasn't receiving support from the VA. He was a veteran, like Warren's. Warren explained that Leon had no health benefits. Leon was discharged from the military without honor because he was homosexual. Just recently, I think about 2 weeks ago, I was able to procure Leon's Section 8 discharge papers from the National Archives. Despite his specialty as an intelligence observer and his training as a Russian translator, Leon was deemed mentally unfit for service, not eligible for reenlistment, induction, or reinduction, not entitled to mustering out payment, and ultimately not entitled to veterans' benefits. Janet and Bob took action and urged Warren and Leon to have a civil union. In 2000, Vermont made history as the first US state to introduce civil unions for same-sex couples. Some Vermonters celebrated this as a victory for civil rights. Others described it as an example of social rape or moral rot. Warren and Leon were reluctant to have a ceremony. For these gentlemen of a certain age, it was strange or queer for same-sex couples to be recognized like married heterosexual couples. But there were very practical and pressing reasons to secure the protections of their legal status. Townsend's treasurer, Mickey Wasung, a link is here with us today, got word of these plans for a civil union and exhorted the couple to choose a date. Ultimately, she convinced them to have the civil union on the day of the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001, arguing that some joy in the world was desperately needed that day. A simple ceremony took place at their home, with Mickey officiating as Justice of the Peace and Janet as witness. Warren wrote in his own obituary that he met Leon in 1944, the same year Leon was discharged from the Army. Warren began his military service in the Army Medical Corps as an ambulance driver. So if Leon had been hospitalized in 1944 which I learned from data at the National Archives, perhaps Warren was able to visit Leon at a mental institution. According to historian Alan Berube, the discharge process for homosexuals could include abusive interrogations about personal relationships or solitary confinement in hospitals or stockades. I can imagine Leon feeling isolated, frightened, depressed. Did Warren, the ambulance driver who befriended him, provide comfort and courage to persevere? Like most of you, I haven't done much traveling over the past few years, but research into the lives of Warren and Leon has been my vehicle to travel across time and space. I crossed the Atlantic with them on the Queen Elizabeth. I was a guest at Leon's luxurious ancestral home in Rostov, a city on the Don River in Tsarist Russia. I went to Weimar cabarets, revues, and queer nightclubs with Leon. I bicycled with Warren in the French Riviera, where he learned the antiques trade at the end of World War II. Warren disclosed to his doctor and friend, Bob Backus, that he was a European operative for the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. So perhaps those bicycle rides included clandestine meetings in cafes and alleys with spies and saboteurs. And I met some of you here back in the early 80s. We toasted Warren and Leon with crystal glasses of sherry. And then we walked to the Common and watched a film crew shoot a comedy starring Chevy Chase. The movie itself was pretty forgettable, but Warren and Leon were not. So I welcome all of you to the start of a new journey. Let's call it Mantiques Roadshow. My version of the PBS series is part adventure, part history lesson, part treasure hunt, but it's more than that. The Roadshow has roots in a blog post that my late father wrote in the mid-1990s. The blog is still up. You can check it out, www.farklempt.com. I often return to my father's writing when I miss him. He posted on family history, including a small section that he called the Gay Corner. He briefly describes Leon as a bachelor, because that's what we called gay men back in the day. My father didn't have any details about Leon except that he was an interior decorator in New York. Keep in mind that when my dad was writing this blog, it was around the time I came out of the closet. So perhaps this was a way for my father to make sense of his son's transformation and identity. I'm grateful to so many of you gathered here. You were, in the words of writer Armistead Maupin, the logical family of Leon and Warren, whereas my branch of the family tree were simply biological. And after Leon spent time with my grandparents in Boston, I have to wonder, why did these branches on the Ingall family tree sever? I could have met Warren and Leon 30 years ago. Would that have eased my coming out as a young gay man? There's so much joy in discovering Warren and Leon today, but at the same time, there's so much longing and loss. So what's next for Warlé? Well, here we are again with Lewis Carroll. That may include more writing. So there may be essays, an illustrated catalog, a work of creative nonfiction. Community engagement and conversations. My hope is that this project will inspire us to take better care of LGBTQ+ elders who have experienced so much trauma and rejection. Can we commit to welcoming the stranger, immigrants and refugees like Leon, and recognize that their creative gifts and diversity only strengthen our nation? I want Warren and Leon's story to be a spark that inspires others to share stories of their LGBTQ+ ancestors, logical or biological. I've refreshed the Warlé brand. I've got swag here. I have a Warlé button. It can be yours too. And I've preserved Leon's hand-lettered text, but I've made a few changes. The border surrounding it is infused with pride. And there's an arrow to suggest migration flow and the human right to travel freely if necessary. The original logo has New York City, but I've added Townsend for its significance in the lives of Warren and Leon. I'd like to share my research in a way that's visually intriguing. If Warlé was a jewel box of a boutique, the display of documents, photos, and objects must capture that essence. I'd like to acquire a portmanteau and transform it into a traveling display case for pop-up exhibitions. I want to thank Grace Cottage and its equity team for this opportunity to share what I've learned. Thank you in particular to Scott and Dave for leading this effort, both at Grace Cottage and Valley Cares, to support LGBTQ+ centered care in Windham County, as well as for your hospitality. And most of all, I want to thank Warren and Leon's friends who are here with us today, and for those who are on Zoom. I couldn't have done this without you. You've enriched my life personally and professionally. And now I'd like to thank some of those friends to come up and share a very brief story and share an object if you have one. I'm going to start with Renata Constantelis.
Well, just to give you a brief story, in 1961, I arrived in New York City. And from 61, now my speech is not prepared, so I'm doing free flow here.
And it's got to be short.
I try to keep it short. So 1961 through 1971, I was an obsessive antique collector. And in those days, in the early 60s, Third Avenue in New York City was full of antique stores, and it was haven for me. And eventually I ended up on 81st Street, seeing the antique shop of Leon and Warren. You walked in, it was a nice entrance. To the right was red, to the left was blue. Everything was beautiful, and it really was the old world. So we became good friends. First I became a customer, and before you know, I would go after work with a bottle of cheap champagne, and we would be drinking champagne. So then at one point, Warren said, we really want to retire in Le Cannes in France, but it's not feasible. But we also would like to retire in Vermont. But we don't know how to drive. So what did I say? Oh, that's no problem. I know how to drive. I can take you there. And lo and behold, that's how it got started. However, I was already friends with Leon and Warren maybe for 4 years. When I used to buy things, I would tell my husband, oh, I got this long time, because everything I did was in secret. I shouldn't spend money. So anyway, so then I says, gee, how am I going to introduce Leon and Warren to my husband? Because if I take him, he has to come with me. Well, I arranged it. Leon and Warren took the train, and I live in Eastchester, New York, which is near White Plains. It's about 25 miles out. And here we are. I introduced the two gentlemen, which was a little odd, but they hit it on perfect. So then, of course, I showed Leon and Warren all my goodies that I have. And here we were sitting on the table, drinking coffee. I served in my best dishes. So Leon Warren, being curious what it is, he lifted up the little pitcher where the milk was in it. It actually wasn't milk, it was heavy cream I put in. He turned it around just to see the emblem. He completely forgot that there was cream in there. So anyway, thereafter we immediately started off searching a place. Where do we go to Vermont? So we went throughout Vermont. We went as far as Barrie. But their mind was set on this corner. And it was my husband, and the first house, it was actually one of the houses in this region. It was Annette Peterson, I think was her name. She was the real estate broker, and she says, I think I have a house for you. And it was $82,000 at that time, and that was in 1977, 78, something like that. So Warren said, oh, that's too expensive, $82,000. So my husband said, Warren, the lady doesn't mind showing it to you. And that's how it got started. So eventually they ended up buying it. And then we helped them moving here, and the rest is history.
Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Maria Sagat, 93 years old, is that right?
Yep.
Still drives, lives in Astoria,
Still driving,
Queens. The oldest friend, surviving friend of Warren and Leon. They met in the early 60s. Leon was working in the fashion industry. This was his last job, I believe, working in fashion before he moved over to the boutique full-time to work with Warren on Lexington Avenue. And Leon needed a seamstress. So he hired Maria. And before I let you speak, I just wanted to say something that I just found so moving. And to learn about Leon was that he recognized your talents as a designer. And he encouraged you to go to FIT.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so we work, I work a few years, about 2 or 3 years with them, you know. And in the meantime, I was going to school, you know, for designing, you know. And then he decided that he was going to leave to go into the antique business. So he left me there, he left me, you know. But then, well, while we were there, you know, Warren came one day, which I never met him before, you know. He came, you know, and introduced me to Warren, you know. And they decided to go into antique and also interior decorating. So in this way, I help him out too there, you know. Taking a lot of, they took a lot of jobs, big jobs in New York, you know. And we worked together, you know, I was going after work, my job, I was going there and helped them out too, you know. I became close friends, you know. And then, I think you didn't tell them about why they moved the antique, why they closed.
I think they moved because they had to move. They lived in a very fancy apartment off Park Avenue.
No, I mean the shop.
Why they moved the shop?
They closed it. They closed the shop because
Maybe the rents were
next door. No, next door.
Yeah.
Next door there was another shop, different things, yeah. And the owner got shot, got killed. Yeah. And that did it for them. And they said, this is time to move.
Oh, yeah, probably because
This was the 1970s when, you know,
Yeah.
Ford told New York to drop dead because
Right.
of all of the crime.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it was
Yeah.
Lindsay.
Yeah, that was the time.
Yeah. Was
And
tough.
so they bought it. So after they bought the land here, they told me one Sunday, one weekend, can you take us up, So we came up, and Warren was amazed. He said, wow, the first time I came up here, the lady, I don't know which lady, took us, took 2 days to come up.
Oh, was a neighbor, yes.
Okay.
Yes, was a neighbor.
When we got to Connecticut, she said, okay, that's it. So they had to stop there and stay overnight and then come up the day after, So anyway, since then we were close friends. I came up so many times. I was involved.
And that's how Maria and me met. Through Maria.
Right. We met through, And I spent a lot of evening down the city there, going out for dinner with them.
Drinking champagne.
Yeah, right.
Andre champagne.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for
Diana Lane.
I think
Okay,
I got his arm. Thank you.
no problem.
I'm going to lean. I used to teach aerobics. I don't know what's happened to my body all of a sudden. But I'm here to talk about desserts. They had so many good dinner parties that I was lucky to be included in. And, the table was beautiful, the food was good, and the conversation, and it was just all very good. At one dinner party, they had a little gift at each place setting. And mine, appropriate to me, jewelry person that I am, was this neat little, it's a necklace that can also be a pin. And it was sitting at the front of my, the top of my plate. And everybody else had as appropriate a gift, such a nice thing. And then they had a party one time where, I had made some red velvet sachets, strawberry, with green felt leaves. And I had them in the basket by the cash register in the hardware store. We used to own a hardware store. And Warren and Leon came in together, and they were just taken with that little basket of velvet strawberries, and they bought the whole thing. And I was just, The next dinner party, those red velvet strawberries with green leaves were on the table, up and down the table. I was just touched, And then the third party I want to tell you about, the dinner party. It was desserts and champagne. Desserts and champagne. That's it. There must have been a variety of 34 desserts, maybe, and we thought we had to sample all of them. And champagne, and champagne, and champagne. I tell you, we got giddy. We got giddy, didn't we? We were hysterically laughing about everything. It was just so much fun to have them in our lives. They really brought that spark. And one time, they came to one of my parties and came up the stairs to what was the exercise studio at that time. And Leon had dressed up for the party, and he had on like knee socks and lederhosen and embroidered suspenders and a little Tyrolean cap. He was dressed full Austrian to come to my party, and I just thought, thank you. He just added so much. Both of them made me feel like I was just a lucky person to have known them. Thanks, Warren and Leon.
and Leon were a real important part of our family. We moved, my husband and I moved here 2 years after Warren and Leon did, and we ultimately had 3 kids, and one, I want to share 2 different short stories. One was we had just a month before adopted our second child, and I went to Dr. Backus and found out that I was pregnant. And I walked back, I'll tell you, in a daze from Dr. Backus's, because I had a child that he was older, but for me he was 1 month old, and I found out I was going to have another one too. And I was sitting on the common and really just in a, I guess in a daze is the perfect way to put it. And Warren came along, and he was the first one that I told before my husband that I was having a baby. So Warren and Leon became the godparents of our youngest daughter, Isabel. And they were really the grandfathers for my children. And we celebrated holidays with them, and I want to say the exact same thing that Diana just said, is such a wonderful addition to all of our lives, and they meant so much to our whole family. And another thing I want to add about the dinner parties, which were really wonderful, was that Warren never ate. Warren, he would always bustle about, and everything was perfect. Table perfectly set, food was perfect, but he would never sit down. He would serve all of us, and it was just very much fun. And the other thing I want to share is that my husband and I had a kids' clothing business, which was located right next door at the old Mary Meyer. And Warren used to make his very famous flan for us. And he, whenever, that was his signature gift, or not gift, dish to bring to your ubiquitous Vermont potlucks. And it was delicious. And he used to come down, and our whole company, so it would be like 25 people or so, we would all go out and we would all party, and Warren would out in the side yard, and Warren would bring his flan, and serve everyone, and we all derived a lot of pleasure from that.
You also told me about the snickerdoodles on Halloween.
Oh, right. Really the place to go in Townsend on Halloween was Warren and Leon's house, and they always made, Warren, I think, was the snickerdoodle chef, and he always served them, and the kids just loved going there, and it was a real special spot. Yeah.
What do you have here?
Oh, I completely forgot. This is one of Leon's sketch pads that he gave to Isabel, our youngest, and with their logo here, which said, as you said, Leon Ingall, London, Paris, New York.
He had it all planned out.
Yep. And it has the 17-inch waists and on all of them, and and also our business was a clothing business too. So he was he did design sometimes for Jeannie Mac to share things that he thought we might like. But I can, do you want me to show these or save them and pass them around?
For later.
Yeah. So I will keep these and show anyone. But they're beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you, Jean.
Yeah, you're
Jean.
I may add, Warren wrote a poem about you and your husband.
Oh, right. You know what? That's what I should have brought. That's
Send
what
it to
I
me.
should- Yes.
He was a great poet. If he liked your story about something, he knew how to embellish.
If we get through the show and tell, we'll hear one of Warren's poems at the very end, okay? Thank you, Jean.
Yeah.
Rob. Please welcome Rob Thompson, Jeannie's brother-in-law.
Oh, as much as I hate public speaking, I'm really happy to be here because Warren and Leon were really special friends for my whole family. I think I was probably in my 30s when I first got to know them. So I got to go through the whole progression of them, their life for many years, and it was quite extraordinary. Leon, as you mentioned, was the shy one, and I loved him dearly, but Warren and I had a special connection. You know, there was a unspoken depth to Warren that didn't always get revealed, and I brought this painting that he gave me that kind of speaks to it. He had quite a bit of religious artwork around his house, very deep side of him. He was sort of known for his flamboyant, parties and stuff, but I had my strongest connections through these, and this was in his bedroom by his, on the side wall by his bed, and I always admired it, so he gave it to me, and now it sits by mine, and I'm really happy to have it. So this story has to do with Warren as he got older, and he lived right down the hallway here, and over the years, I'm a handy guy, so I always was involved with helping out, fixing things and doing stuff. And at a certain point, Warren was getting kind of older. I think at this point, he really wasn't getting out of his room at all. And so I go down and visit him, and he always had this really finely manicured hair and quite a beautiful beard. And he started getting pretty shaggy. And so at one day, he begged me to cut his hair and trim his hair, and I was like, oh my God. So I did it. I did it probably twice, and at that point in my life, I was kind of a member of a cult, and I realized there were a lot of men in my life that were in this cult, and it was this guy named Zico, and he was a barber a haircutter down in Brattleboro. Magical haircutter, young Egyptian guy, quite good looking and curly haired, and you'd go down there and he would spend like a half an hour with you, wash your hair, dry your hair, massage your hair. Most of you women probably get this all the time, but for men this is very unusual. And it's just really an experience. So I went down and I asked Zico if he would mind on his day off coming up and cutting my friend's hair. And he said, oh yeah. So I arranged a time, and I made sure I was there to be there to introduce him, and he brought his suitcase full of equipment, and I put my chair right across from Warren, who sat in a chair, and Zico pulled out his equipment and started working on him, and it's hard to describe this. All of a sudden, there was this moment, and I realized there was no mirror in the room for Warren, so I was sort of the mirror. And Warren's it was like I was seeing his soul sing. It was just, Zico started doing his magic, and Warren realized what was happening, and it was like we were in a time out of time and space. It was like the three of us were in this magical place. I've never seen Warren like this, and it was quite amazing. And that was the day Warren joined the cult of Zico. And I think from then on, Zico would make an arrangement, and Zico would come up, once or twice a month and do his magic for him. But it was, Warren just had this real deep connection, and there were moments you would have with him like that were quite special. Thank you.
And our final story is from the heroine of the Warlé narrative, Janet Kramer, social worker extraordinaire. Janet has her own object for show and tell. You're over here. But I brought the gift that Warren and Leon gave to Janet which she in turn gave to me. It's a Russian icon. And on this Russian icon, there are these metal objects called revetment, or risa in Russian. And they're there to protect the oil painting that's on this piece, but also they serve a function. When you need a blessing or you need healing or if you want to thank God for something, you add a metal object. And I just think it's a wonderful metaphor for caregiving. Anyway.
Thank you. And I didn't prepare a speech, and yours was lovely. And this whole experience is bringing back to me the great experience of working primarily with Warren, because Leon was pretty far in Alzheimer's by the time I knew Warren. I was a wandering social worker for the VA in White River Junction, sent to see a vet who was having real problems sleeping because Leon had sundowning. So he was up all night and sleeping during the day, and we tried to figure out how we could admit Leon to Grace Cottage so that Warren could get some sleep. And unfortunately, the paperwork at that point, which was in probably 1998 or 99, was lengthy enough that we couldn't do that kind of change. So I'd certainly experienced the struggles of how do you incorporate a couple where one has a dishonorable discharge and the other one is a wonderful caregiver, but still in need of support. Bob Backus, the change in Vermont law, my shifting from the VA to work as a social worker with the visiting nurses, because I retired I thought I had retired in 1999, and it didn't take. I'm still practicing as a social worker 3 days a week, and at 86. So I had a chance to see Warren before Leon died, because I had the opportunity to be the one witness for their wedding. And this is why I brought these flowers. I couldn't imagine coming to a wedding without some gift. And I stopped at New Fame Greenhouse, and they had a single spray of white Asiatic lilies, which was just perfect. As I discovered, it's hard to find one single spray of Asiatic lilies. So I brought a bunch. But because I had known Warren with Leon, I had the privilege of sitting and listening and supporting Warren when he lived here at Heinz Home. He was a very careful drafter of a will, and so we did a lot of talking back and forth together. He explored the idea of giving his house to Grace Cottage. He and Bob Backus were a very special team together, figuring out what really mattered. The haircut was remarkable, and it both transformed him and transformed his soul in wonderful ways. So I think probably today has brought me the earlier Leon and Warren, and I have the privilege of knowing what his gift has meant to Grace Cottage and to people here in Townsend. Thank you for finding me through the attorney who wrote the will.
So, to wrap up, a call to action for all of you: collect stories of elders and ancestors and share them. Support initiatives like the Equity Team at Grace Cottage. Be vigilant, stay engaged, and preserve our civil rights. Thank you. So now I would like to invite Bucky and Carlene to come up to the stage to read a poem written by Warren.
Arlene would rather listen.
Okay.
I appreciate very much this opportunity to take a walk down memory lane. By the time that Leon and Warren had moved to Townsend, Carlene and I were off in other parts of New England and the country, beginning our lives as a young family. But our roots have always been in the West River Valley and especially in Townsend. And so we knew of Leon and Warren, and we knew the importance of them to the community. So this poem is one of Warren's poems, and it allows me to, as I said, take a walk down memory lane, remembering Warren and his talents and gifts to the community. And this particular gift is especially meaningful because it is dedicated to a person who is very near and dear to our hearts, who is Carlene's father. And just a quick aside, Carlene's father was my mother's doctor and my doctor and our doctor for a couple of decades, and he was the first person to see me on this earth. So it's rather unique to have a father-in-law who delivered both you and your spouse, and our middle child here at Grace Cottage. So,
Born at Grace Cottage.
yes, we were as you can tell by the gray or lack of gray, that we were pre-Grace Cottage, but weren't in the West River Valley. Anyway, words from Warren. So it might help if you would forget that you are here in this wellness room and transport yourselves, maybe it would help to close your eyes, to the Townsend Common, and you can picture Warren in the gazebo reading this poem on Fair Day to the crowd around. And if it, because this is where Warren shared it with the West River Valley and those folks that were there at Fair Day on August 7th, 1999. Who is this grace with arms spread wide for those in pain and those in fear, for those who fall by life's wayside, whose cries she never fails to hear? Who is this grace whose cottage door stands always open day and night, who answers yes when we implore and gently takes away our fright? Who is this grace who at life's end enfolds us in her soft embrace? Who is our kind and loving friend? I ask once more, who is this grace? How came she here to these green hills just 50 years ago today? To towering pine and birdsong trills, to winter snow and summer hay. Grace came to us as one man's dream, a dream he took and nourished. Beginning as the merest gleam, in a short time it flourished. Born up north in Addison in the year 1911, he came south his race to run at the age of 27. The year was 1938. The man was Carlos Otis. His arrival now seems planned by fate. At the time, no one took notice. Young Carlos and his gracious Ruth settled here in rural Townsend. He followed his own inner truth. Now we know he was a godsend. In 49, Grace Cottage came. Carlos saw his dreams come true. West River towns were set aflame with hope for all that would ensue. Grace Cottage had her shining morn on August 7th, 49. The first of several thousand born arrived next day, a happy sign. I asked before, who is this Grace, this special friend who waits nearby? She is those who left their trace, whose gift of love will never die. Across the years, they fought the fight, an army charging up the hill, doctors working through the night, nurses helping them with skill. Grace is those who scrub the floors, and those who washed the bed sheets, who cooked the meals, did countless chores, pressed on like mighty athletes. Now, 50 years have slipped away since Carlos brought us grace. This common that we crowd today was then a quiet place. Perhaps he stood here on that day, alone and silent, lost in thought, then smiling up at a blue jay, was happy in what he had wrought.
I'm speechless. This is part of the reason that Grace Cottage is so special, that we can have gatherings like this to embrace and honor our legacy, our history, our special culture, and I really think that we need to give Andy a standing ovation for all the work he did on this. Refreshments are in the next room, and we invite you all to stay and continue to share your stories, which are so very special. And I apologize for the generator and the fire. It reminds us that life goes on outside of these walls as we cherish our past. Thank you all so much for coming and sharing.